Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Freedom Side Live. I am one of your hosts, Rania Khalek, and joining me today is Eugene Purrier, who's had a makeover and now looks a lot like Zoe Alexandra. Joining me today is special guest host and a dear friend of mine, so I'm very excited to be sitting alongside of her, even though we're not
next to each
place.
other.
We're next to each other on screen. Zoe Alexandra, the managing editor of People's Dispatch. Zoe, thank you so much for joining me to guest host the Freedom Side Live today. I'm sure our audience is well familiar with you because you've been a guest, but now you're on the other side.
Yeah, it's very exciting to be here. Very excited to dig into this insane news week with you. So,
yeah. Well, we've got a lot of really great guests, including one of my favorite people, Jeremy Scahill of Dropsite News, as well as Claudia de la Cruz, coming to talk about the New York City mayoral race. Jeremy will be talking about the ceasefire, the ceasefire. Got to put that in like huge sarcasm quotes in Gaza. We've got Julian Park coming to talk about Trump being crowned in South Korea. Johanna Tablada. Johanna Tablada is going to be talking to us about all things Cuba related in recent weeks. Lots happening there. And then we have José Luis Granados Ceja. Did I say that right? Yes?
Perfect.
Yes? Yeah, thank you. Mexican journalist with Venezuela Analysis to talk about. I mean, I have no idea why we would want someone to come talk about Venezuela today. Not much happening there, but we'll see what Jose has to say.
Not much there at all.
And also, I'm going to use this as a moment to do some shameless self-promotion for the show I host regularly, Dispatches. Yesterday, you and I recorded an episode, Zoe, like an hour and 20 minutes long, all about Venezuela and what's not happening there, which is nothing, about the looming U.S. regime change war that's like tightening around Venezuela's neck. So people can look forward to that. And also just the administrative, bureaucratic things out of the way before we get the show started. I want to remind people that Breakthrough News is an independent media outlet that functions and continues to grow and prosper thanks to the support of our viewers, not from pharmaceutical companies or like weapons companies, but from our viewers like you. I sound like PBS now. So if you support the work we do here at Breakthrough News, please consider opening up your wallet and becoming a member by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news. For as little as $5 a month, you can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch. But most importantly, you can be helping to support independent media in a moment of an insane attack on our First Amendment rights and a moment of extreme suppression. I also want to remind people to smash that like button, you guys.
Smash that
it helps.
like button.
Gotta do it. You gotta do it.
Gotta smash it. It helps boost us in the algorithm that hates us. The algorithm hates us. It actually is amazing. Like, I'm pretty convinced that like there's just somebody at YouTube who like presses a button every week to make it so less and less people see us. So if you don't support that and you want to fight back, please support us any way you can. And one of the easiest ways you can support us is by smashing the like button, making sure you're subscribed to Breakthrough News on all social media platforms. And also make sure you hit that notification bell so you can actually get a notification whenever we put up new episodes or go live, like right now. And Zoe, is there anything you want to add before we jump into it?
I would just say that people have to support independent media right now. And if you're watching, you should be sharing this link to at least 5 people you know, so they can also be tuning in and hearing the incredible analysis that we're about to dig into, because I know everyone's wondering what happened this week, because it's been a doozy so far.
As every week is these days.
Yeah.
No, I love that. I love that. Send this to 5 people that you know. Nothing less. And with all that said, we're going to get right into it with our first guest. First, let me intro the story here, you guys. As everybody knows, unless you live under a rock, New York City is on the verge of making history. We've got Democratic Socialist Zohran Mamdani poised to become the city's first socialist mayor. And the political establishment is in a full-blown panic. He's not only a Democratic Socialist, but he's also, dun, 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 a Muslim socialist. Very scary stuff. And that has triggered a bipartisan meltdown. Mamdani has been smeared as a terrorist, an anti-Semite, a threat, an extremist. And of course, this is all because he did the worst of the worst, and that is advocating for, God forbid, free buses, subsidized grocery stores. Subsidized grocery stores. And worst of all, he's opposed Israel's genocide in Gaza. Andrew Cuomo's campaign, as many of you may have seen, even posted and then quickly deleted an AI-generated ad depicting something they called criminals for Zohran Mamdani. And it's actually worth queuing up that clip if we can. It's so insane, the levels of racism in that clip. So if we could please show that clip, and then we can get started on some analysis.
Zohran Mamdani's opponents want you to believe he's an inexperienced radical whose policies will make New York City more dangerous. But what do his actual supporters think?
Mamdani isn't crazy.
He's just trying to even the playing field.
Give everyone a fair shot. Sure, he said multiple times we need to defund the police, but that was just a metaphor.
And yes, he did say crime is a social construct, but that was also a metaphor.
His main backer, the Democratic Socialists' ideas are common sense, such as
decriminalizing misdemeanors, like shoplifting.
For unlawful abiding citizens like us, globalize the intifada.
I'm a criminal. I'm a criminal. I'm a criminal.
I'm a criminal.
Yep. I'm a criminal.
for Zohran Mamdani.
I didn't have a real job until I was 30, but sure, give me the keys to the city. What's the worst that can happen?
Paid for by Cuomo for NYC.
Oh, there's so much happening there. So you know what? Instead of opining ourselves, I'm going to go ahead and bring in our first guest, and that is the wonderful Claudia de la Cruz, former presidential candidate and executive director of IFCO Pastors for Peace. Claudia, welcome to the Freedom Side Live. Wow. So I'll start with this. Zohran is poised to become the first Democratic Socialist mayor. Why do you think his campaign is striking such a deep chord with working class New Yorkers? And why is the political establishment panicking to the point where they're putting out crap like that?
First of all, that video is disgustingly racist, and it reveals so much from the ruling class and so much from what is the machinery of electoral politics in New York City that is very much connected and funded by Wall Street. I just have to say that. I feel like Mamdani's campaign is in many ways an expression of where people are ideologically and where people are socially. I think in many ways, because it addresses the insane cost of living in the United States, in New York City specifically, is the main reason why it strikes a chord to the working class people in New York City. I mean, it speaks to the question of how high rents are. It speaks to the question of, how insanely costly transportation is. It speaks to the fact that we don't have childcare places. I mean, as a mom, I could say that, like, the concept of having affordable, not necessarily even free, but affordable childcare in New York City is almost non-existent. And so he speaks to the question of affordability that has been such a pressing issue for New Yorkers for decades, and issues that have been in many ways neglected by other candidates. And so I think more than whether he will or will not get to a point to advance these things, the message, the demands resonate with working class New Yorkers who have actually had it to the top of their foreheads with the cost of living in New York City.
You know, Claudia, seeing that video, I think it's important to remind people that actually Andrew Cuomo is from the Democratic Party. It's hard to remember watching that video, but it really speaks to this element that there is truly a full-blown bipartisan meltdown over Mamdani's candidacy. And it's not just because he identifies as a democratic socialist, but as Rania mentioned earlier, it's because he's a Muslim socialist. And again, he's been called a terrorist, an anti-Semite, a threat, an extremist, really for these simple demands that you mentioned that speak to people: free buses, subsidized grocery stores, opposition to Israel's genocide in Gaza, which has been a major issue that's moved millions of people in the United States and within New York City. So, you know, this outsized kind of crazed response from both parties, for you, what does it reveal about the racist foundations of these parties? And how should the movement respond to these attacks and future attacks?
I mean, I think it's important to, everything you said, Zoe, everything is, it reveals the very inherent nature of the politics that are at the core of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, because these are politics of the ruling class, ultimately. So it's very revealing that they're unwilling to take even a small step towards progressive politics. They are committed to ruling class politics because, let's be real, free buses is not anything. There are other cities that are under Democratic rule that have, free buses. So it's like, that's not as radical as you might think of it. Accessible, affordable childcare or free childcare is something that happens under capitalist societies. It's a thing. So it's not that this man is so radical, like so hardcore socialist, that he's talking about, the redistribution of wealth. In fact, he's also said he wants millionaires to stay in New York City, right? So, and he's also speaking to real estate, and he's also, in many ways doing the political game as it has been established for so long. So they are, in principle, against any type of progressive politics. And this is something that, again, I'm so glad you brought up the fact that Cuomo is a Democrat. Because again, it reveals that the Democratic Party is where movements go to die. They are uninterested as an institution to move anywhere further than just a couple steps away from Republicans. That is where they want to be. The Islamophobia that has come, the racism that has come out of that, the criminalization of the demands of working class people, in so many ways, the vilifying of the Palestinian movement. I mean, all of that was expressed in that video. And that is inherently at the core of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, because these parties are part of the ruling class. And so it's a revelation that I think we need to be really aware of, because it's a call to action for every progressive and person of consciousness to move towards building an independent political movement outside of what the ruling class has imposed on us.
That partly answers the next thing I'm going to ask you here, Claudia. And that is, obviously, like Mamdani's campaign, like you were just talking about, it's challenged not just Republicans, but also Democrats in their alignment with real estate, with police unions, with Wall Street. But that said, he is running as a Democrat. And, you ran for president last year on a third-party socialist ticket that was outside of the two-party duopoly, right? And I guess my question here would be, how do we confront the risk of all of this discontent with the system right now getting co-opted and funneled right back into the Democratic Party that helped create the crisis in the first place?
I mean, I think one of the biggest deficiencies in this country is the level of disorganization and disunity amongst working class people. And if you add to that a lack of political clarity that has also been an imposition of the ruling class in many different forms and ways, like the co-optation that you mentioned is a co-optation that has come the quotation of the movement for Black Lives, for example, in many ways, kind of turning a demand for Black liberation into, the nonprofit machine, right? And then funneling the energy that was out in the streets during the George Floyd rebellions into a front against fascism that did not defeat Trump ultimately, because Trump is here again. And so I feel like we need to learn from that history. And one of the biggest lessons is that we need to build, again, independent organizations, that we cannot in any way, shape, or form allow the discontent of the people to continue to be organized by the Democrats or the Republicans. That the grievances that our people have will only be tended to if we actually reach a deep and real transformation of society from its very roots, from its economic system. And that level of clarity, again, is something that we need to build in our local communities, in our cities, in our states, in our organizations, whatever those organizations are, whether they are student organizations, labor unions, whatever organization we're a part of, we need to have an ideological, political clarity that the system that we have and what they offer us is not enough to meet the scales of the problems that they themselves have created, that they are uninterested in fixing those problems. And if we don't have a movement with that clarity, then we cannot have an actual, real political proposal in the electoral front. We have a Democratic Party that says and has said historically that they are the representatives, they are the ones to fight for the working class. But I would beg and ask people to reflect on how have they actually fought for the working class. These are people that have the economic and political power while Trump is here attacking working class people to actually call for so much more and do so much more. And they are mediocre in the way that they approach all of the attacks that Trump and his administration and the billionaire class are launching against our people. There are very few that have taken a stand to actually defend the cities in which Trump is deploying military and ICE. And so you're going to tell me that with the political and economic power they have, they cannot do anything? They actually could do everything, and they choose not to. And they have always chosen not to. When Roe versus Wade was overturned, when they rolled it back, it wasn't simply because, the Democrats didn't have enough votes. Well, there was a moment where they had the Senate and they had the House and they didn't do anything. And so it's like, we have to understand, that they aren't there for us. And unless we build a movement with that clarity that is unwilling to be co-opted, that is unwilling to compromise, in our politics, in our ideology, in our stubbornness to be able to move forward the livelihood of our communities, then we will continue to make the same mistakes. And I think, we are in a moment, and this is why we are being so heavily attacked in so many different fronts, where people are coming to that understanding. We are being attacked not because we're weak. We're being attacked because people, after 2 years of genocide, have deepened their consciousness, are able to make connections, are unwilling to be taken back to the 1800s. And therefore, on the end of the ruling class, the only solution they have is brutal force. To break the will of the people, to break our resistance, to break our commitment. And so in that same vein, we need to get prepared, not only to continue to fight, but to fight to win.
No, it's well said, because sorry, Zoe, did you want to add something in there?
No, I think, it's exactly right.
Well, no, I think that's really well said, because, as Zohran, every poll has him winning. So he's likely going to be the next mayor of New York, and they're going to do everything in their power to make sure he cannot govern. I'm sure that, Trump is going to push for sending in the National Guard, all the things that you just said we need to be prepared for. So we look forward to, we're going to have you on again after he wins, so we can talk about what we do next. Claudia de la Cruz, thank you so much for joining us on the Freedom Side Live.
Thank you so much for having me. Zoe, I love your jeans makeover, by the way.
We got 3 women on here, baby.
Hey.
I love it. It's the girl power hour.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
that's what we're gonna have to change the name of the show for this week to the Girl
Power
Hour.
Hour. Okay.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Girl Power
All right.
Hour. I like it.
Yeah. Yeah. With Zoe and Rania and only other women and then sometimes men if we allow it. All that's to say, I mean, Zoe, it's going to be super interesting though to see what happens after Tuesday. I imagine that unless Zoran gets more, like if he gets under 50% of the vote, like if Cuomo and Silva actually like get, like obviously neither of them are going to win, but like let's say Zoran gets 48%, the establishment, the centrists in general are going to be like, well, the majority of New Yorkers didn't vote for him. So I think we're going to see super interesting.
Something like we see in Latin America, maybe fraud allegations, legitimacy crisis. They're going to pull a electoral fraud narrative on New York.
Guarimbas in the streets. Oh God, that would be horrible. And then like suddenly they're going to regime change New York City.
they're going to
put it under sanction.
They're going to try.
Oh no. Oh no. All right, let's hope that doesn't happen. All because they don't want like one free bus.
And one cheaper grocery. Like, come on.
Yeah, I saw this like crazy report about how all these like billionaires and 100 millionaires are like buying fourth jets and second jets because they get like a massive tax break. And I'm just like, you people are so detached from reality. I'm honestly surprised that there aren't like riots over the level of inequality in this country. But if they keep doing this, eventually there will be. So we'll see. But on that note, we're gonna shift gears a little bit to move to a different part of the world, and that is Asia. So quite a bit. Yeah, we're gonna. Oh wow, that's a good one. Holy crap. We are going to pivot to Asia. If you saw the news this week, you saw that President Donald Trump visited South Korea for the APEC summit. And he faces global backlash over these one-sided trade deals that he's got even American allies upset over, which included a $200 billion payout from South Korea and pressure on the country to increase defense spending. And that meant, of course, buying U.S. weapons. And in a striking display that I think shocked all of us, the South Korean president presented Donald Trump with a golden crown, highlighting the extreme flattery leaders are using to try to appease Donald Trump. And I believe we have a clip of that. Oh, God, such embarrassing crowning.
Connection between the authority of the heavens and sovereignty on earth, as well as the strong leadership and authority of a leader.
경주를 국비대로 차리신 우리 트럼프 대통령님께 한반도의 처음으로 평화를 가져온 신라의 정신과 함께 한미 동맹의 푸른기를 상징하는 이 금관을 선물로 준비하였습니다.
We present this gold crown to you on this joyous occasion of your state visit to Gyeongju, because it symbolizes the spirit of Shilla, which brought peace to the Korean peninsula for the first time, and the opening of the golden age of the Korea-US alliance.
Oh my God, that is just so embarrassing and honestly reminds me of the display. I think it was maybe the Prime Minister of Pakistan at that Gaza peace signing who was like, I nominate Donald Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. We love you, sir. You're so hot. I mean, at that point, like it's just pathetic.
What are we doing here?
I don't even know. But joining us to figure out what we're doing here is Joo-hyun Park, member of Note.dal and web editor here at Breakthrough News to discuss the Korea trade deal, protests against U.S. economic coercion, the growing resistance of workers in Asia, and Trump's upcoming meeting with China's Xi Jinping amidst escalating trade tensions. Joo-hyun, welcome to the show.
Rania, great to be back. Zoe, good to be here with you too.
Glad you're here.
Well, yeah, because we got to make sense of this display of groveling. Let's start there. Let's start with that display of groveling from the South Korean president. What the hell? Go.
I wish I could explain it, to be entirely frank with you. It's definitely over the top. I think it caught a lot of people by surprise. The crown that was gifted is actually a replica of a national treasure of, one of the crowns from the Shilla dynasty which is one of the original, kingdoms of the Korean Peninsula. And so, this is like effectively giving a replica of any other national treasure from any other country. I think like maybe the best analog I can think of is like being gifted an oil replica of the Mona Lisa or something to that effect, maybe a replica of the crown of the Queen of England. It's just a little bit beyond what you would expect. Well, not just a little bit, but it's extremely beyond what you would expect from typical state-to-state relations. Absolutely. I think it, is also a sign of the massive pressure that South Korea is under in the tariff negotiations. For the last 6 months, give or take, the US and South Korea have been locked in these tariff negotiations after the Trump administration initially threatened 25% tariffs on all Korean goods. That number has now been reduced to 15%, but in exchange, South Korea is having to put up $350 billion of state-backed investments, $200 billion of which we are now finding out will be made in cash. And that's going to happen over the next 4 years. There was a lot of back and forth over this, particularly given the threat that this posed to South Korea's foreign currency markets. And I think, even though the deal is not quite as onerous and extensive as the Trump administration still wanted, it still poses a pretty incredible economic threat to South Korea's long-term solvency, because essentially what the Trump administration is going for here is to import many of South Korea's most productive and important industries into the United States, which would push South Korea down on the ladder economically in terms of its global standing. And in addition to that, as we've discussed on this show many times, Washington has incredible political, military leverage over Seoul. And I think all of that comes into play when we consider, the way in which these negotiations shake out. We have to remember that it is the US that ultimately has operational wartime control of South Korea's military. That is something President Lee Jae-myung, who, was just in that video clip you saw there presenting that crown to Trump, that is something he says he wants to get back by 2030. But, whether or not that will be successful, of course, has yet to be seen.
There's so much to get into here. And I think some of the clips that are playing on screen of these mass protests is a really key point. But I wanted to touch back to kind of this broader issue of the tariff talks. And it seems crazy. I mean, we're, 10 months into Trump's presidency, and he has, in a sense, proven that through force, through threats, and through really the power of the dollar, he can actually force all of these countries to bow down, to essentially give up their own national sovereignty and to give the US the best conditions possible, even with allies. I think the case of South Korea is just kind of a slap in the face, a country that has already ceded so much of its sovereignty. However, I wanted to get to maybe what was the headline today, which was the much awaited and much expected Trump and Xi meeting. Reportedly, they finally reached an agreement. What is your take on this? Is this good for the global South? Did Trump really kind of like get what he wanted? Did Xi get what he wanted? Tell us all about it.
Right. So, well, I'm sure that there will be an outstanding episode of the China Report on this. So let's start there. But I think when it comes to, the Trump-Xi meeting, which of course was highly anticipated, we have to remember that over the last month, the trade dispute between Beijing and Washington has really accelerated. China made the move to reassert its export controls over rare earths, which are critical for pretty much all modern technologies. And from what we've learned so far out of, their meeting that was held, they've more or less called a truce in the trade war for, they say, up until the next year. The People's Republic of China has agreed to start repurchasing soybeans from the US, though from what I understand, it is actually at a lower quantity than what they were purchasing before. They are relaxing and lifting those export controls on rare earths. And, the Trump administration is also responding by, peeling back a lot of the measures that it had taken against Chinese exports, against Chinese shipping as well. As for, is this good for the global South? I think it's difficult to say, in these times. Like, absolutely, we know that, increased trade wars and, this kind of increased tension in the Pacific doesn't really benefit anyone except, a certain class of, American political elite. But aside from that, I think this broader question of Trump's tariffs and their effects on the global South are really one of the kind of undertold stories of this year. Because I think what we need to understand is that this is really US imperialism reasserting itself, finding new ways to hold on to its position at the perch of the world capitalist system. And I think for anyone that is concerned with multipolarity or with the rise of kind of alternate powers and an alternate system beyond the US dominated so-called rules-based order, there really needs to be an understanding that, the intention of these tariffs is to keep the US in its place, to firmly tighten the leash around all US allies through financial measures, and also to really limit the possibilities of global South countries that are currently lower income, middle income from rising above and being able to, change their economic situation in the near to intermediate term, because the world still does largely operate in a way where the US is the largest market. A lot of production around the world does rely on the US in order to realize profits from their own production. And so I think that, what's been going on with Trump's tariff wars around the world is hugely significant for the global South. It's bigger than just what's happening in this particular dispute with China, but we really have to look at the cumulative effect. And I think that, what we may see is that a lot of the rising possibilities that were anticipated in the global South are certainly going to be blunted, although I don't want to say that they'll necessarily be stopped by these developments, since there is a particular trend that is happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's really insane. And you would also think, Julian, that all of this would be pushing these US allied countries in the region closer to China rather than having them grovel with crowns for Donald Trump. But I mean, obviously that's like a very symbolic display, but this isn't, I don't think, sustainable. This kind of bullying behavior towards your allies, right? So I'm just curious, like, what do you think about the prospects down the line of the US being able to just maintain these relationships based purely on bullying? I mean, it might work in the short term, but in the long term?
I think down the line we'll need to see. I think what we can say is that in a lot of East Asian countries right now, there has been a tendency to pursue a kind of two-track strategy over the last 10 years, where they attempt to both widen their economic relations with China and at the same time maintain political and especially military relations with the US. And starting really under the first Trump administration, then picked up under Biden, and now really being accelerated under this Trump term, is an attempt by the US to really economically discipline these countries through these tariff measures. And I think that, that's essentially what we're seeing, right? The US is not just going for these one-time payments and investments. They're essentially going for leverage against these countries, right? They're going for ways to import production from countries like South Korea and many of the important industries like batteries, automakers, shipbuilding. Part of that $350 billion that South Korea has pledged to, will $150 billion of it will go towards this project known as Make American Shipbuilding Great Again. They're going to actually be building South Korean nuclear submarines in Philadelphia, for example. And there will be South Korean shipbuilding conglomerates, some of the biggest heavyweights in the ship planet, that will be infusing massive sums of capital into the US in order to build up the shipbuilding industry in the US. So economically, what this is doing is that it's a way of kind of cannibalizing the economies of East Asia in a way that actually increases dependency over time. And so while, I think many of us would like to believe that, the bullying will have to reach a limit at some point, people's dignity will just simply have to assert itself. I think that, what's actually going to make the difference is whether or not movements are able to rise that can politically challenge the current leadership in a lot of these countries, which, it just has to be said, are not putting forward the real kind of like dedication to sovereignty that's necessary in the world that we're living in today. I mean, we can look at Japan's tariff deal just as one example. Japan pledged $550 billion in investment, and Donald Trump essentially gets to personally control where those investments go. And I think that that's really important for US workers to pay attention to as well, because while the Trump administration is saying that all these measures are going to create US jobs, I think it does remain to be seen, well, will they? Will they actually go towards creating US jobs, or will they, go towards building perhaps industrial capacity, create a limited number of jobs? How much of it is going to be funneled towards AI? How much of it will be simply wasted through corruption? And I think that we need to kind of understand this moment as not unlike the bailouts that we saw in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, where you had huge sums of capital being infused into the economy in the names of saving it. But the actual real conditions that face the working class in the US got worse as a result. And inequality certainly widened. I think that, that may well be the outcome that we see in the US as well, as the years tell with time.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say,
we're going to keep doing this. We'll get it right. We'll get it right.
I mean, we have maybe 1 minute left. I don't know, Joo-hyung, if you can just tell us quickly, there have been these protests almost every single day by movements in South Korea, trade unions, popular movements. What are people saying on the streets right now?
On the streets right now, people have been saying for a long time that these demands need to be totally rejected. There is no acceptable level of investment to be made in the US, right? These are state-backed investments, which means that they are backstopped by the taxpayer. So this is money from Korea's working class, which is going into the pockets of Wall Street. And that is something that people are very upset about. And I think that, rightfully people are asking, what kind of alliance is this, right? Is this actually a partnership between equals? And I think pretty plainly the answer is no. And, that being the case, we know what the solution is. It's US out of Korea. You can check out Noruto's US Out of Korea campaign at usoutofkorea.org to learn more about that. But it is simply the case that, people, the organized workers, the progressive social movements of South Korea for months have been calling for the president to assert sovereignty. And there was a just total failure to achieve that in the last couple of days. And instead, there was quite literally a crown being given to the president of the United States, who, it must be said, has been facing so-called no kings protests for months now on his own. And it seems that, South Korea's ruling elite's answer is to actually say, yes, kings. And I don't think that's something that anyone should accept.
Well, Joo-hyun, I'm so happy that we can have you on this show to break all this down. It's a story that will continue to develop, so we'll be doing it again in the near future. But thank you so much for joining us on the Freedom Side Live.
Thanks for having me again.
Well, Zoe, we've got another great story lined up, but I just wanted to express my extreme frustration with YouTube. I wish there was I could go shout at them. I just can't deal with this. This suppression is driving me crazy. You feel gaslit. You know what I mean? You feel gaslit when you have over 1 million, as someone pointed out in the comments. You guys, I read the comments. Someone pointed out in the comments, they're like, I started watching the show 2 years ago and there was 1,000+ viewers. Mm-hmm. And now, we struggle. Right now we're at 154. And I appreciate all 154 of those views. But there's obviously something weird going on when you've got over 1 million subscribers to your channel and you can't crack 150 viewers on a live stream with two amazing people like us hosting it and such a great list of guests and really popular topics. It's just insane. So YouTube, if you're watching, we see what you're doing. And if anybody watching has friends at YouTube or knows somebody, I'm not joking, email Breakthrough News. Go get in touch with us, because it's just incredibly frustrating to be this suppressed.
Dictatorship of the algorithm. Can't escape it.
Dictatorship of the algorithm. Can't escape it. Almost like the dictatorship of imperialism, which is actually a topic we're going to pivot to. Not that we ever went away from it, but no, we have our next guest is a really good one, but we will be turning now to Cuba. I'm sure many of you noticed there was a horrific hurricane that made landfall this week, Hurricane Melissa, one of the strongest Atlantic storms on record. It battered the Caribbean, but Cuba reported no deaths despite widespread destruction and chronic shortages caused by the ongoing U.S. blockade that is strangling the country. And this also comes after the UN voted 165-7 to end the 63-year embargo for the 33rd consecutive year, condemning a policy that deprives Cuba of food, medicine, and fuel. So let's go ahead and show a clip of Bruno Rodriguez, the Cuban ambassador to the UN, or the foreign minister. Bruno's the clapping back. Foreign minister, sorry. Clapping back at the U.S. UN ambassador, Mike Waltz.
It's propping up the Venezuelan regime, and it aids cartels. The facts are that these cartels that it props up are trafficking people, drugs, and weapons, and is aiding and abetting instability in our hemisphere. They undermine democracies in our hemisphere.
I'm very sorry to interrupt, but there's a point of order from Cuba.
Sure. Madam President, yes.
Yes, we have to give the floor to the point of order and the representative of Cuba.
El representante permanente de Estados Unidos no solo miente desviándose sustantivamente del tema, sino que se expresa de manera grosera y prepotente contra su presidencia, contra la dignidad de esta Asamblea y de los Estados miembros. Lo hace con una incultura, rudeza y grosería que no se admite en este magno y democrático recinto. Señor Walsh, esta es la Asamblea General de Naciones Unidas, no es un grupo de Signal ni es la Cámara de Representantes.
So that was a pretty amazing interaction or back and forth. Joining us from Havana to discuss all of this is Johanna Tablada de la Torre, Deputy Director of U.S. Affairs at Cuba's Foreign Ministry. Johanna, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you on. And, you know, despite being hit by one of the strongest hurricanes ever recorded in the Atlantic, your country, Cuba, reported 0 deaths. Can you walk us through how Cuba's disaster preparedness system is able to achieve this?
Well, as you know, Cuba has an excellent track record when we talk about risk reduction, disaster management, and preparedness. And in this case, the record can be checked. So it is there to be checked. We work in different stage, and during the entire year with the National Cuban Civil Defense that works permanently on plans of risk reduction with local governments, municipalities, civil society, and all entities and individuals. When a hurricane or other situation like heavy rains and then that with meteorological information, we could be aware before that it will hit Cuba. Immediately, Cuban authorities call the National Council of Civil Defense, that is also head by the president of Cuba, that from that moment on turned into be the chief of the Cuban National Defense System, that it is civil, but it includes all the resources of the country, all organizations from the civil society, entrepreneurs, and different actors, and of course local government. As it happened right now in this situation, days before Melissa, almost 1 million Cubans were evacuated from houses that were not strong enough to deal with a probable Category 5 hurricane, like it was the case, although after hitting Jamaica, the Hurricane Melissa arrived to Cuba with as a Category 4. So the solidarity between even the neighbors is important, but our preparedness system has a priority. The number one is to save life. And that's why you can check that during so many years, being exactly in the poster child path of hurricanes in the Caribbean, the numbers of people that pass away or that unfortunately die during a disaster is substantially lower in comparison with other countries, including, by the way, United States, that is a rich nation with all the resources. And I think it has to do with those priorities and the way that we organize. And the results right now, as you mentioned, is that so far there are communities that we can reach directly because of flooding, but the information reporting from all municipalities and villages is that there are not human lives lost during this episode. Of course, we also work with the shelters during all year, creating shelters when in order for taking people to safe areas when the hurricane comes. We are working with food supplies, diesel and transportation and health facilities. That could be a plan B. When, like it happened in this situation, some of the hospitals and health assistance center has been destroyed. So I think that summarizing, this is the most important thing about how Cuba can mitigate the risk during all year. Is not a one-day plan. Is an entire is a work, a collective work during the entire year.
Well, Johanna, I think it's incredible to hear, especially given that we're at the 20-year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina in the United States, where over 1,400 people were actually killed in that storm. But even so, I mean, Cuba is able to do this despite being under the boot of U.S. imperialism and the U.S. blockade. And a lot of people have said that, you know, the blockade has really made recovery even more difficult for Cuba. So how would you describe the impact of the 63-year economic siege on the Cuban people in its ability to respond to natural disasters and be able to, as you said, protect its people in these kind of events?
What it has been characterizing the history of Cuba, it's what happened?
Oh, you're still there. We can hear you.
Okay. No, I could hear another voice and I didn't know. Anyway, let me go back to your question. What it has characterized the history of Cuba after the triumph of the revolution is that our closest and very rich neighbor has been putting obstacles from day one in order to prevent Cuba to develop at its real capacity. That has made our life very difficult. Everything costs more to Cuba than to other nations. But in the case of the preparedness for disaster, we are always be taken in consideration that we won't receive any good hand from U.S., so that we will be at our own, and that maybe other countries, as it happens, will assist, or even individuals and organizations from the United States. So the entire system is getting ready the whole year to create reserves of water and supplies and medical equipment and medicines in order to assist in a situation of emergency like this one. But definitely the answer to your question is that yes, it's more difficult for Cuba, because in a situation of an emergency or in a situation of a disaster with this magnitude, like the one that we are watching now in the eastern part of Cuba, you will get offers for donation. For Cuba will be more difficult because banks are under the prosecution list of the State Department. People will send boats with aid to Cuba, as some countries are offering already, but they will have to find a boat that will be willing to touch Cuban ports without thinking about going to the United States in 6 months, because this is the scope of the punishment that undeservedly Cuba has. Any boat or vessel touching Cuban docks will have to wait 180 days to touch U.S. port just for visiting Cuba. And we are an island. There won't be a Pan-American road when you can send aid from U.S. to Mexico and from Mexico to Honduras or to Belize. So in that situation, we are in disadvantage with our neighbors. And we can go on and on, going through remittance. Right now, the natural attitude of a relative that will see their family in Palma Soriano or Contramaestre or Holguín or Guantanamo, some of the affected areas would like to do what any other immigrants in the United States would like to do, which is will send remittance to their grandmother, to their mother, because they lose the roof of their house when that person grew up, when that person turned to be a professional without paying a dime because he happened to study in Cuba, now is living in the United States. Well, if that person will go to Western Union, they will let them know that since Marco Rubio arrived to the State Department, remittance has been prohibited again. And And we can go on and on. Cuba tomorrow, you would like to buy. Go ahead.
Johanna, I wanted to ask you with regard to what you're talking about. We mentioned in the opening that there was the vote this week at the UN, and 165 nations voted to end the U.S. embargo on Cuba. And this was the 33rd consecutive year of overwhelming global condemnation of this blockade. So I'm just curious, what does this latest vote say about world public opinion, and what kinds of pressures did Washington apply to try to sway that outcome?
Unprecedented pressure were enforced by the Secretary of State himself this year upon his counterpart from different countries of the world in order to turn this historic vote in favor of the Cuban Revolution necessity to put an end to the Cuban embargo in United Nations. The results, I'm happy to report that he failed. For many years, when he was a senator living in the bubble of the U.S. Senate, he will punish the American diplomacy for not being strong enough to get Cuba to resolution overturn or defeat in United Nations. I know because I've been dealing with U.S. for more than 30 years that a State Department official for many years will report back to Congress and say, hey, it's not easy. It's not easy to tell the entire world that the embargo doesn't exist, that it's not making people suffering. Because from day one, the Cuban blockade has been extraterritorial. So it just not hurt Cuban population. It also prevents other countries to freely travel to Cuba, to freely trade with Cuba, to freely send transactions when we buy goods from those countries. Doesn't matter if it is Canada or Germany or Vietnam or India. It's still, they will have to take a lot of precaution to be not, in order for not to be punished unfairly by the illegal legislations adopted by the United States to use starvation as a tool to shock the Cuban population, to put obstacle to every source of income for the Cuban economy for purpose of destabilization and eventually domination, like they've done in so many other parts of the world. Like we've seen what happened in Gaza with the 100% complicity of the United States governments and weapons and fake narrative to justify genocide. So this is what we are facing too. The blockade is genocide. So right now, they threat countries with everything, and they also offer money. Remember now that you have a Secretary of State that is in charge not just of the American diplomacy, but also of the U.S. money for foreign assistance. In our case, this is a nightmare because he will be delivering money for anybody that will be willing to replicate those fake news and demonizations and weaponizing information in a misinformation permanent communicational operation. And he's also in charge of the national security, I call it the national insecurity team of the White House. So he will decide which is the paper that the president will read. Probably you have an accurate report with one agency say, hey, this is hurting the Cuban population. Well, this is not, doesn't fit to be used. You know what I mean? So we are very happy, just to wrap it up. Well, it was an overwhelming majority that again stood on the right side of history. And that is true too, that in this occasion, United States had the capacity to convince 7 countries or 5, because Israel has been always defending U.S. policy, but they convinced five countries to go with U.S.
Johanna, we could go on and on about this U.S. blockade and little Marco Rubio's many devastating policies he's got in the position of power he's in now, but we'll have to come back to this. I just want to thank you so much for joining us on the Freedom Side Live. Johanna Tablada, Deputy Director of U.S. Affairs at Cuba's Foreign Ministry. Thank you so much. And On that note, we speaking of Marco Rubio and speaking of Gaza and Israel, which she mentioned there, and all of the hell he's wreaking around the world. You know, Israel just launched, Zoe, these major airstrikes on Gaza earlier this week in the deadliest attack since this U.S. brokered quote unquote ceasefire was announced. And President Donald Trump defended the attacks along with little Marco Rubio. I'm just going to stick with that name. Trump came up with it, but I love it. I think it's fantastic. But in all seriousness, this ceasefire violation by the Israelis killed over 100 Palestinians, including some 46 children on Wednesday. Here is what Trump and Rubio had to say when they were on Air Force One. We're waiting for John to cue up the clip. There it is.
Before they bombed Gaza, and is it still a ceasefire?
Yeah, it's a ceasefire. It is. No, they had a sniper, and one of their soldiers were killed, and they did retribution. So we'll see. But yeah, it is a ceasefire. It's back to ceasefire.
What is that?
What is the thinking behind? Talking about the strike against the Palestinian Jihad individuals? Yes. Yeah, look, Israel didn't surrender its right to self-defense. Obviously, the ceasefire is based on obligations on both sides. By the way, we'd also like to see Hamas speed up the return of hostage bodies. We still have 13 hostages, 2 Americans included. But we don't view that as a violation of the ceasefire. They have a right if there's an imminent threat to Israel, and all the mediators agree with that.
Well, there you have it, guys. There's still a ceasefire, despite the fact that Israel just killed over 100 people, according to the people who gave us the ceasefire. So joining us to discuss all of this is Jeremy Scahill, co-founder of Drop Site News and one of the few Western journalists in regular contact with Hamas leaders, to discuss why Israel, with U.S. complicity, is undermining the ceasefire and what the next phases of this ongoing genocide could look like. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure to be with you.
So let's just jump right into it. I mean, the ceasefire, we're supposedly in ceasefire mode, but this is not the first time. I believe every single day there's been a ceasefire violation. The last count I saw was something like 128. So can you just give us some idea of what this ceasefire means so far? Because it seems like from what we're seeing, one side is ceasing fire and the other side is continuing.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's important to understand what's happening right now as the Trump administration trying to seize opportunity that is a mixture of what Trump and his largely neoconservative foreign policy team wants to achieve in the long term in the Middle East. They were enthusiastically behind Israel's genocidal war. They've been fully backing Netanyahu's attempt to serve as the arsonist in chief of the Middle East, and Trump is mixing together the business of imperial America with his personal business. And so part of what we're seeing here is that Trump and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and Steve Witkoff, his special envoy, of course, is a lifelong real estate man. They're looking to make a lot of money, not just in the context of their official capacity for the U.S. government, but on a private level. And so if we understand that Trump may have forced Netanyahu to kind of restructure his war of annihilation temporarily, and that Netanyahu remains a kind of pit bull that the United States has been very happy to unleash on the region, that Trump is sort of keeping close-ish to the leg, but still allowing it to viciously attack other people. And my apologies to pit bulls. I don't. They can be actually quite gentle dogs, so maybe that's not the the most appropriate thing. But he has this vicious monster actually. And Nasrallah, the late Secretary General of Hezbollah, often address this issue of who's actually in control, the United States or Israel. And I think that what Trump is showing is that the United States is in control right now in the sense that they can impose some form of restraint, force Netanyahu to only kill 10 Palestinians a day instead of killing 100 to 200 Palestinians a day. There's a level on which Trump saved Israel from itself in this because the Palestinians were not surrendering. They were not raising the white flag. Israel was not, in fact, able to retrieve its captives in Gaza through the use of military force, and in a way was forced to go to the negotiating table with Hamas and Islamic Jihad and with the Palestinian people. On the other hand, Israel sees opportunity in this, and I would say that they're still in pole position because you have little Marco coming out, popping from behind Trump's shoulder to really drive the point home that Israel is going to be able to strike whenever it fabricates or comes up with some rationalization for why it's okay to do a drone strike or why it's okay to launch missiles into Gaza. But at the end of the day, the war of annihilation, and I've been saying this, since this so-called ceasefire was signed, it's more important now than ever for us to be vigilant and not take our eyes off of Palestine, because the war of annihilation is continuing. This, Rania, in the very big sense, is an attempt by the United States and Israel to achieve through fabricated diplomacy, claims of a ceasefire, claims of the greatest peace plan in 3,000 years, for them to achieve through these kinds of agreements and trickery by trying to co-opt Arab states and other Islamic states to the Israeli-U.S. Zionist agenda to compel the Palestinians to surrender when for 77 years they've refused to do so under the iron fist of militarism that's been unleashed against them.
Jeremy, in the past 2 years, it seemed like kind of insane because on one hand, you have Israel attacking Gaza, attacking Palestine as it's done. But there were times when it was bombing Syria, Lebanon, Iran, all at the same time, even launched airstrikes on Qatar. Yet we saw Arab states line up behind Donald Trump when there were talks in Egypt. As we said, the Pakistani prime minister saying that Trump should win the Nobel Peace Prize. But really, there is this deep complicity and sort of excitement from Arab states for this deal, for this ceasefire. What do you think is behind this? And what is their vision with this ceasefire and with Trump's vision for the region?
I mean, it's a great question. It's one of the central questions, but it doesn't just have one answer. I think we have to look at the different spheres of influence that have emerged in all of this. On the one hand, I would say that you have one sphere that is largely populated by Egypt and Turkey. And I think that in the case of both Egypt and Turkey, they're not interested in seeing Palestine completely wiped out or even seeing Hamas and the Palestinian armed resistance thoroughly destroyed. In the case of Egypt, Egypt is the second largest recipient of U.S. military aid, second only to Israel. Egypt patrols the only international border that Palestine has out of Gaza, which is the Rafah crossing. And yes, the Israelis, even when technically the crossing was quote unquote open, the Israelis were in large control of it. But the Egyptians, and I think, Palestinians are very well aware of this, Palestinians involved with the negotiations. The Egyptians want to see Hamas and the Palestinian armed resistance severely weakened, but they see some geostrategic benefit to having a Palestinian armed resistance, in part because of Egypt's own interests and own relevance to the United States. Turkey has emerged as a force in the world under Erdogan that is increasingly involved with diplomacy, views itself as a bridge between NATO and Europe and the broader Middle East. And Erdogan also, I think, sees a lot of common ground with Trump. And part of this is also transactions that extend beyond the White House and into the realm of private industry and private business, as we said before. And the other side of this, you have Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The Saudis are looking at this and they're saying, wait a minute, Qatar just got a mutual defense agreement with the United States that is very similar to the Article 5 pact within NATO, these mutual defense agreements that an attack against one is an attack against all. Saudi Arabia has been licking U.S. boots for decades, wanting something of this nature, and the Qataris come in and they get this. And what I've been told recently by sources who've been in the negotiations is that in the case of both Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, that they actually want Israel to be empowered to fully destroy Hamas and the Palestinian armed resistance, in part because of fears that Hamas and the Palestinians that are fighting against Israel are an inspiration to Arabs and Muslims around the world. And, these decrepit, corrupt monarchies, the thing they fear the most are actual Muslims in their countries who are saying, you don't represent our religion. You don't represent our vision of the world. You're corrupt. You're thieving all of the natural resources. You're collaborating with the Zionists. You're collaborating with the United States. And so, the Saudis and the Emiratis, in large part, I think are perfectly happy to watch Israel continue its war of annihilation, despite the lip service that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia pays to the notion of a two-state solution and ending the genocide. But yes, Palestinians throughout this genocide, you're correct to point out, have said, what's the point of all of these armies that these Arab nations have when you witness an attempt to completely annihilate the Palestinian people as a people in this world. You watch a live streaming of the genocide, the burning of children alive in tents, the scorched earth bombing, the terrorism that is sponsored by the United States, and you do nothing but issue strongly worded statements. Or in the case of some Arab states, you actually join the United States and Israel in trying to counter Iran's response militarily to Israel attacking Iran. So, we're watching a world right now in which all of these leaders, most of these leaders from around the Arab world, have bent the knee to Donald Trump. They're making all of these business deals with both Trump the man and Trump the president. And, they're essentially in front of the world being made to admit that they understand Israel is allowed to bomb any country that it wishes in the region. It's bombed roughly 9 countries since this started 2 years ago. You mentioned the bombing of Qatar. That's an interesting case. September 9th, Israel launches strikes, 12 missiles, against the building in Doha, the capital of Qatar, where Hamas had its offices. Hamas had established diplomatic offices in Qatar in large part because the United States government wanted the Qataris to be able to negotiate with them. And it's also the headquarters of U.S. Central Command, which is the most strategically important military facility in the Middle East. The idea that Israel was able to launch these attacks against Qatar without the knowledge of or agreement of the United States to do so is just an implausible reality to imagine. The question is whether the United States was in on that bombing plot of this Hamas facility, or they just allowed the Israelis to do it. But the fact is that right now, Israel has shown for 2 years that no one is going to restrain it when it comes to attacking countries around the region. And I think that a lot of these countries are just trying to make sure that they get in on the Gaza privatization deal that Trump wants to push through.
It's really, truly incredible. I mean, just as an aside, I was in Lebanon when the Israelis bombed Qatar, and I'm smiling a little bit only because that was like for the first time we were messaging our friends in all the Gulf states being like, you guys okay? Because it's usually the other way around. But in all seriousness, I mean, yeah, it's these Gulf states should be more worried about the people that actually bomb them or are threatening to bomb them. Because Israel, basically, I think one of the Israeli spokespeople, or maybe it was like the speaker of the Knesset, had tweeted something insane like this is a message to all Arab states when they had bombed the Qataris. But all that to say, Jeremy, I want to move this conversation to the U.S. front for a moment, because Israel is basically militarily supreme in the Middle East right now. They've, at least for now, defeated or pacified many of their enemies. The region, I don't see any source of real resistance to Israel at this point militarily. However, the world hates Israel. World public opinion hates Israel. U.S. public opinion has turned on Israel because of what they've done over the last 2 years. So they have kind of moved their front over to the U.S. They've joined forces with the Trump administration to try to suppress the movement for Palestine here, and to try to attack our First Amendment rights, our due process rights, to try to suppress the anti-Israel sentiment that's growing. And you see a backlash specifically in the base of the Democratic Party, where AIPAC, I never thought I'd see this happen, has become almost like poison, to the point where you had someone like Senator Seth Moulton, hardly, some like progressive. I mean, he's pretty centrist, but he returned his AIPAC money. So, I mean, that obviously is more of a symbolic gesture. But what do you make of this shift we see, where Israel's increasingly becoming aligned with the far right of the Republican Party, where even there's like some tension growing? I mean, half of the right-wing base or MAGA base thinks that Israel killed Charlie Kirk. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's not true. They think it. But yeah, I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on that shift in the U.S.
Well, I mean, Seth Moulton is actually a good example because, yes, on the one hand, he seized a moment of political opportunity and recognizes that the winds are blowing in a different direction. And so he says, oh, well, I'm not going to take AIPAC money. But then within, I think it was 24, although it may have been 48 hours of saying that, he went on national television to clarify that he's going to continue to do this work for free, even if he doesn't get the AIPAC money. And I think there's a way in which that kind of captures a certain dynamic within the Democratic Party. I mean, you had Charlemagne the God labeling Hakeem Jeffries, the lead Democrat in the House, AIPAC Shakur. And you've had a Democratic Party that has been a total servant of this genocidal war. If anyone should go down in history as the butcher of Gaza, it should be Joe Biden. Kamala Harris had a chance when she assumed the reins of the 2024 Democratic nomination through an undemocratic process to differentiate herself. All of her advisors were constantly messaging to the Washington Post or other media outlets, oh, Kamala is very concerned about this. She's been raising these concerns about the death toll among Palestinians privately. And then she's finally asked about, what she would do differently. And she says, I would do nothing differently. So the Democrats cast their lot with this policy of radical Zionism and genocide, and they delivered Trump. If the Democrats want to talk about who's responsible for what we're witnessing right now, in both the case of the Gaza genocide, where Joe Biden, who was the most dedicated Zionist to serve in political office in the United States, a 50-plus year in political office, where he was a servant of a radical Zionist agenda, they delivered this Gaza genocide. They could have shut it down before Trump was even elected president, but they facilitated a sabotage of ceasefire agreements. Then the Democrats run on a campaign where their candidate says that she would do nothing different from Joe Biden. Gaza was a major issue in this election. Trump actually forces a ceasefire through in the dying days of the Biden administration for his own reasons. It lasts for 42 days. The Democrats still say almost nothing when Trump then allows Israel to abandon the ceasefire deal in March, reimpose a full spectrum blockade on Gaza, and then begin scorched earth terror bombings. The Democrats even had a chance then, when it was quote unquote Trump's war, to come out and say something. And yet you have this silence. Even the best that the Democratic Party can produce on a kind of large level, Bernie Sanders, he almost never says the word Israel. He says, oh, the right-wing Netanyahu government. He acts as though he's not aware of the public opinion polling in Israel that shows a majority of a solid majority of Israelis firmly behind this genocidal war. So young people in this country, working people in this country, and that applies all around the world, not just in the United States. For the first time, the world sees the totally naked truth about the nature of this serial killer enabled by the United States that masquerades as a nation state. That's what this is. It's a European colonial settler entity that operates as a serial killer with full support of the United States and masquerades as a nation state. The world sees this now. And so the Democratic Party, Rania, in the United States has a real choice before itself. Are you going to listen to the will of your own people and of the rest of the world on this issue? Or are you going to continue to facilitate figures like Donald Trump holding power in the United States? Because young people are rejecting the New York Times. They're rejecting all of the cable news networks. That's not where they get their information. They are much more independent thinkers. The Israelis have diluted the term anti-Semitism by misusing it and applying it to anyone who opposes their policies, including Jews around the world, to the point where young people aren't afraid of that label anymore. It used to send shockwaves through someone to be accused of that. But when everyone is an anti-Semite, no one is an anti-Semite, and it's Netanyahu and the Israeli government and the US government that's promoted, that's been responsible for that. There is real anti-Semitism in the world. The force that has made it so that we can't have a real discussion about it is a state that claims to be a Jewish state, is a state that claims to be representing a religion when in fact Jews around the world have been rejecting this even before the genocide began. So we're in a moment I'm sorry to go on for so long, Rania, but we're in a moment where we have a government that is using stormtroopers masquerading as ICE. They're rounding up our brothers and sisters because of their immigration status or because they're suspected of having a certain immigration status, and it turns out that they're American citizens, where they're trying to criminalize speech. And Palestine has, I know you know this, Rania, but Palestine has always been the canary in the coal mine on these so-called terror laws. When you research how these terror laws got on the books in the United States, it goes back to attacking people who were either Palestinian or were advocating for the rights of Palestinians. We are living in a perilous moment. And Trump himself can stand up and laugh and say, I thought I was going to see resistance from the Democrats. And instead, we have the average age of the leaders of the Democratic Party. It's like in their early hundreds. Like they were around, some of these people were like adults when the Balfour Declaration was imposed. So how, It's the Democratic Party is in an existential crisis that it refuses to recognize. If there was ever a moment to show actual resistance, it would be now. And yet, again, I go back to it. It's young people, it's working people around the world who see the truth as though it's true, and that's very dangerous for established politicians.
Well, I think the last before we let you go, I just wanted to touch on one point you said, and I think you referred to it now again, but it's that, this hasn't ended. It is a ceasefire for only one side, and you said that now is not the time to let up. What do you see the next period looking like? What is needed from the millions of people around the world that have been activated in the struggle for Palestine? And what's next?
Look, I mean, what I can tell you from talking to sources and covering this, and not just people from Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but from across the political spectrum in Palestine, they recognize that this is a do or die moment, that they're at a crossroads. What Trump is advocating is a neo-colonial agenda that is seeking to wipe out the Palestinian cause of liberation once and for all. And that's why the Palestinians very wisely are saying that they want a democratic coalition that represents the diverse tapestry of Palestinian society to be negotiating what comes next, not just Hamas, not just Islamic Jihad. Those were the primary armed wings that were fighting against this genocidal war. But now it's the question of what is Palestine and the cause going to look like? What about the question of disarmament? Palestinians are saying it's not about Hamas giving up weapons. What you're trying to do is use disarmament as a proxy for surrender. What you're telling us, and what Macron and other European leaders are saying when they say that the Palestinians must be disarmed as part of a two-state solution, is you don't want us to actually have a state. You want us to live in little mini Bantustans. You want us to live as third or fourth class citizens. If anything, right now, we should also be focusing our energy and our attention and constantly promoting the voices of Palestinians from the occupied West Bank. Because while Trump may have Netanyahu at somewhat of a kind of restrained position where they're killing a lower number of Palestinians every day, Gaza genocide could resume at any moment. That's true. But the West Bank is being dismantled. It's in the midst of the largest forced displacement campaign since 1967. You have constant attacks by paramilitaries, settlers who are totally empowered by the Israeli military. So ordinary, everyday people, I know all of you are on social media. Find voices from the occupied West Bank. Find Palestinian voices and promote them. Let people know, don't take your eyes off the occupied West Bank. Yes, we should all be focused on Gaza, but the Israelis are already unfurling this war on the occupied West Bank. So it's keeping it in the conversation. It's pressuring any political elected official or candidate that you run into. You question them about this. It's not just about the AIPAC money. That can be a convenient thing. Oh, we don't take AIPAC money anymore. But if you do the same work for free, then it doesn't solve anything. AIPAC can come and go. Yeah. It's the issue of, do you support this radical, violent ideology of Zionism? And do you think that the United States should be facilitating an arsonist masquerading as a nation state?
Well, Jeremy Scahill, co-founder of Dropsite News, we appreciate your analysis and all of your important journalism. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you both for the work you do.
Well, that was fantastic. Jeremy's great. Dropsite's great. I appreciate everything he had to say there. And yeah, Zoe, do you have anything to add before we move to the next and last topic?
No, I mean, I mean, we keep going back to this question of like the precedent that has been set by this genocide, and the fact that a ceasefire doesn't even mean a ceasefire anymore. Just Israel and the U.S. bending every single word, bending every single rule to what fits for them. And I think we just have to keep pushing back against that.
Absolutely. And another target. Oh God, it just keeps going. Another target of this insane imperialist violence is Venezuela. The Trump administration's a growing aggression towards Venezuela continues to escalate. They've got U.S. warships now surrounding Venezuela and the Caribbean, B-52 bombers, fighter jets, and they're promising military strikes by land, like land military strikes, in addition to what they've already been doing, which is just these extrajudicial assassinations, killings of fishermen, basically in these small boats off the coast of Colombia and Venezuela that have already killed at least 57 people. So I want to show a couple clips of our dear leaders discussing this stuff. First, we've got this tweet actually by the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, which sadly I can't actually read that tweet because of the way it looks. But he's basically, I mean, the gist of it, I'll paraphrase it. I mean, that what you see is an image that he was proudly displaying of the military strike on one of these boats. This is a tiny boat. And he claims in this tweet that they're actually like saving Americans from drug trafficking, and they've killed drug traffickers. I mean, last I checked, drug trafficking is not a capital offense, one. And two, they've given us no evidence that these people are drug traffickers. They just have killed 57 people, some of whom have, I mean, there's a few people on these boats who've actually survived who weren't drug traffickers. No evidence anybody has been. Zero due process here. It's just completely horrific and criminal what they're doing. And then I wanted to play, before we bring in our guest, a clip of, we've got Florida Senator Rick Scott and Senator Lindsey Graham saying some words about what they'd like to do to Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. So let's play
that. If I was Maduro, I'd head to Russia or China right now.
Because?
His days are numbered. Something's going to happen. Whether it's internal or external, I think something's going to happen.
What do you think removing Maduro would signal to other socialist regimes?
It'll be the end of Cuba. America is going to take care of the Southern Hemisphere. And we're going to make sure that there's freedom and democracy.
The examples you're citing also involve ground troops. You said time for Maduro to go.
Yeah.
That sounds a lot like regime change. Are you talking about troops on the ground?
I'll let the president speak to that. I'm talking about a briefing that would expand military operations potentially from the sea to the land. It is time for Maduro to go. It was time for Ortega to go. The Monroe Doctrine has been robustly applied by President Trump.
I mean, a lot to talk about there. So joining us to discuss it is José Luis Granados Ceja, Mexican journalist with Venezuela Analysis. Jose, welcome to the Freedom Side Live.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
So before we get into too many specifics, I guess I wanted to just give you the opportunity to respond to these latest escalations, just your general thoughts about the cruelty and criminality we see taking place by this U.S. administration.
Yeah, it's actually quite difficult to overstate just how terrible, dangerous, unpredictable the situation is as a result of U.S. actions throughout Latin America. I know we're talking about Venezuela. Obviously, Venezuela is in the crosshairs right now, but I've been stressing the fact that this isn't just about an attack on Venezuela. And this isn't just an attack on Colombia. It's an attack on all of Latin America. What we're seeing is a very aggressive United States as part of its efforts to try to regather its forces, to concentrate its attention here in the Western Hemisphere, to build itself back up in order to be able to once again dispute global hegemony, incredibly violent, incredibly aggressive, no regard for international law, no regard for even its own constitution. Everything that we're seeing is clearly illegal, as you well said. 3 UN experts also echoed this. These are extrajudicial killings, and they should be very clear about what these actually are. We have to specify that as many times as necessary, that this is a huge act of illegality, that we're dealing with basically a rogue government that's acting the way that it feels like it can get away with this impunity. And actually, I was just listening to the beginning of this segment. Of course, right? The entire system of international law has been dramatically weakened, if not virtually destroyed, as a result of the genocide against the Palestinian people. And so I think it's really important that the governments of the region, but also the peoples of the region, realize the danger that we're facing here. It's actually kind of difficult to predict what the consequences of this be, but you've just showed these 2 clips. These actors, these violent criminal actors who call themselves political representatives, are now playing with fire. If they really do go through with this, it will, on the one hand, establish a terrible precedent of just simply deciding and labeling a political enemy in the region a drug trafficker and then throwing the door open to any and all actions. We're talking about potential strikes inside of Venezuela, a massive violation of the sovereignty of Venezuela. Venezuela, but also we're talking about potentially, targeted strikes, a hit on Maduro. I mean, it would unleash chaos, not just in Venezuela, because we have to remember this. People seem to think that they've fallen for so much of this propaganda that there aren't revolutionaries in Venezuela. Of course there are. Not only are they revolutionaries, but the state is well armed, well prepared. It is prepared for this scenario. And we're seeing the population respond in a very impressive way, mobilizing themselves, joining up the militia if they weren't already members, access to weapons. This is going to lead to a very dangerous situation that would obviously go beyond the borders of Venezuela and create a real regional crisis, which is why the region has to respond in a united way. I know there's lots of lackeys here, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Noboa in Ecuador, Milei in Argentina, all of them are playing Washington's games, but this is very, very serious and we have to put a stop to this.
I think it's super important to just keep underscoring how serious this threat is, and especially what you're getting to about what it means for the region. So I did want to ask you, how has the region responded as of now? You've also been talking a lot over the last year about Trump possibly escalating towards Mexico. Is there any fear right now in Mexico about what this could mean for Mexico as well? What has kind of been this regional response, and how do people see it implicating for their own countries as well?
Yeah, unfortunately, the response has been mixed. Like I said, there's these lackeys, there's these people who'd rather kind of throw themselves before the feet of the empire, hoping that somehow that will save them. We have to remember, a friend of mine from media here always says, Alina Duarte, the United States doesn't have friends, it has interests. And these countries that are aligning with the United States are doing so at their own peril. And I think really run the risk of eventually being betrayed, because as soon as it's no longer convenient, the United States and its leadership, Democrat or Republican, are going to dump you. And I think they're really, really playing a dangerous game here. I'm really worried about what's happening in the Caribbean in particular. You have to remember, these are small states. There's a reason CARICOM is such a powerful regional organization, because only tonight, united, are they actually able to kind of push their weight around in terms of international politics. And we see, for example, like I said, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago kind of going against CARICOM. And have to remember, Venezuela was very generous to the Caribbean states. The only reason it isn't today is because of U.S. sanctions have punished its economy. And so, they don't have these preferential deals and the access to oil. But Venezuela would absolutely restart Petrocaribe if it had the opportunity to do so, if they were able to get U.S. sanctions off of them. There have also been really positive examples. We saw a statement from various political leaders from throughout the region, published by the Progressive International, talking about the need for a united response for the region to step up. I've been, historically a huge proponent of CELAC, but I think CELAC in this instance has actually failed us. There's this insistence of wanting to have always consensus, and the fact that I think the presidency pro tempore is always rotating weakens its ability to become a forceful actor in the region. This is the moment where we need these kinds of institutions to step up and to actually defend this region as a zone of peace. That's not just a saying. That was a unanimous agreement here, and the United States is representing a direct threat to that. As for Mexico, I think we're already seeing this creep towards Mexico. The second to last attack, so there was one yesterday, but there was one on Monday. And the one on Monday actually happened so close to Mexico that when the United States Armed Forces detected that there had been survivors, they had alerted the Mexican search and rescue team, because it was probably the only country that was capable of actually sending a team out that was in the region. They say it was about 800 kilometers, 400 miles from the coast of Guerrero near the city of Acapulco. So that shows that it's already coming close. And of course, Trump has gone onto the record saying that he wants to do precisely these kinds of strikes that are happening now on these boats. Yes, in Venezuela, inside land, but also in Mexico, that he regrets not doing it in his first term. There are some very dangerous hawks inside of his government who want to attack Mexico. They feel like that is the solution. It's that kind of, attitude that we see so much amongst U.S. policymakers that, a hammer blow can solve everything. Obviously it won't, and it would destroy the bilateral relationship. I actually think that the more sensible people inside of the White House right now realize that violating Mexican sovereignty in that fashion, a unilateral military strike on Mexico, would obviously be a red line for us and would destroy the bilateral relationship, and we wouldn't have the cooperation that they need. You have to remember that the United States, their number one trading partner is Mexico. They need us for migration issues. They need us around drug interdiction. And if they play with fire, then they're going to see a response from this president, Claudia Sheinbaum, who has been very clear that this is a non-negotiable. And if they do go that far, they're going to see that not only does the president have a firm line on this, but the population does, and that they're willing to defend the president, including whatever negative outcomes may come to us as a result of that. This is a population that will not tolerate sovereignty as the violation of its sovereignty, as they won't in Venezuela, as they won't in Cuba, as they won't in Nicaragua, and all these countries that are currently in the crosshairs of U.S. imperialism.
So on that note, I do have a kind of multi-pronged question for you. I mean, I guess all my questions are multi-pronged, but I'm just warning you ahead of time. There's two parts of this question. One is, I'm curious if you could talk a bit about how the Venezuelan people so far are responding in terms of like mobilizing, in terms of self-defense, that sort of internal response. Are they afraid? Are they kind of are they kind of coming, rallying around the flag type of situation? I imagine even Venezuelans who, aren't pro-government are probably like, well, I don't want the U.S. to bomb my country. I mean, I'm sure that sentiment exists somewhere, but usually people don't like to be bombed. So that's one side of this question. And then the next aspect of that is I think about the way that the U.S. is so arrogant when it goes on these military adventures, and they think everything's going to be a walk in the park. And given that there is, an internal preparation inside Venezuela, which you're going to tell us about as a part of this multi-pronged question, walk us through realistically. I mean, I know you can't tell the future, you don't have a crystal ball, but realistically, is it just a walk in the park if the U.S. wants to do a rock war in Venezuela?
So on the first bit, we just published a column by Clodovaldo Hernandez, and he put it really well. Sure, things are on high alert, but people aren't falling into the trap of alarmism, of being too worked up about this. And of course, part of that is because Venezuela has gone through a revolutionary process. There's something called the civic military union in Venezuela, and that's actually a term that came up as a result of the rescue of Hugo Chavez in 2002 in the coup that actually temporarily ousted him from power for about 48 hours. He was rescued by the armed forces, but the armed forces decided to act because they saw the population on the street. And it's something that's deeply ingrained in Venezuela society, that there isn't this kind of division between the armed forces and the population. And then specifically in the case of Venezuela, they do have a militia. So they have an organized militia where volunteers can sign up to be part of this, emergency response branch of the armed forces. And of course, the armed forces themselves operate on a very different doctrine. They operate under an anti-imperialist doctrine, which was implemented by Hugo Chavez. And so they've been preparing precisely for an invasion for decades now. And so they're very much prepared. Would this be a walk in the park? Absolutely not. And of course, as you rightfully point out, what you've seen actually is that even some of the critics on the left and to the right of Maduro have closed ranks because they understand that there are some things that cannot be violated. Of course, the country's sovereignty, the integrity of its territory is not something that can be negotiated. And so you're seeing a rallying around this. I will say there are some who are calling for more military action by the United States and more pressure and are welcoming these aggressive actions by the United States and these bombings. It's the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Maria Corina Machado, who represents the hard line of the opposition. A lot of people had been led to believe and been, fooled by this propaganda campaign that they've been on over the last few months now, to think that she is the only representative of the opposition. In fact, she was largely a marginal figure. Her profile has obviously grown over the last year or so, but she is not this, unifying figure. People do not agree with her in terms of this. Even people who may want to see Maduro leave office are not going to support bombs raining upon them. Opposition journalists have also said, you're reminding some of these people who are calling for an attack, that these bombs won't distinguish between Chavistas and opposition supporters. They'll fall on everybody quite the same. And no, of course not, it wouldn't be a walk in the park. I mean, it would be an incredibly dangerous situation. I really want to remind people this. I have to stress it. We're dealing with a population that has a revolutionary consciousness. They are not going to accept Maria Corina Machado in the presidency. They will not tolerate that. It's quite likely that you would have a very dangerous situation on the ground, up to and including a bloody civil war with Venezuelans killing each other because of U.S. intervention. This is what they're playing with. And of course, like I said earlier, this would have regional implications. This would obviously go beyond the borders of Venezuela, would probably produce a migration crisis that would reach the doorstep of the United States. This apparently is the most important issue for this administration. They're playing with fire here. This would not be easy. They will not be welcomed as liberators as they tried to tell us with the same lies as they did with the invasion of Iraq many, many years ago now.
Well, I think that's a really great point to make, and something we've been talking about too, Rania, just about how the U.S. and Donald Trump is so obsessed with this migration crisis, and the Venezuelan migrants have really been at the butt of a lot of his attacks and these policies, this villainization of Tren de Aragua, the deportation of 250 Venezuelan migrants, yet they want to create another regime change war that would most definitely generate thousands and thousands of people having to flee their homes. But that's not what I wanted to ask you. Wanted to end on a positive note because, you know, this is not happening with no response. You said the response of the region has been a little lukewarm, but I think what we've seen from the people of Latin America and the Caribbean, and really the world at this point, is a very strong stance in defense of Venezuela. So can you tell us a little bit about how people across the world are responding? What are solidarity movements doing and saying? And, you know, does this give you hope?
My faith is always in the masses and be able to respond to this. They are the drivers of history here, and we've seen a very good response. I always highlight actually some of the words of João Pedro Steli from the Landless Peasants Movement, the MST in Brazil, who's very clear. He's like, if they attack Venezuela, we're going to organize internationalist brigades. And of course, that's absolutely the right response. And he says, we're going to send back those soldiers in coffins. Of course. And shouldn't be a controversial take. We're not going to allow U.S. boots on our territories. Full stop. And so the populations of Latin America understand this. We have a very, very long, vivid history of U.S. intervention. A lot of this feels familiar, not just Venezuela, right? But, you know, this U.S. sanctions campaign that's deliberately trying to destroy the Venezuelan economy. They've basically performed miracles there trying to rescue their economy from the punishing effects of these sanctions. For those of you who don't know, it's the dominance of the US dollar that makes it virtually impossible for Venezuela to sell its oil on into international markets in a simple way. They have to go through intermediaries. It's very complicated, and obviously there's discounts. And so, you know, Venezuela has taken a hit as a result of these sanctions, but they've endured. Now, that reminds me so much of, you know, Kissinger's comments about Chile, about making the economy scream. It's a very same kind of logic. And of course, this is only the latest effort at trying to oust Maduro. We've seen the Guaidó circus. We saw, you know, now the support for Maria Corina Machado, the Guarimbas, these violent protests in 2014, 2017. It was an insurrectionary strategy by the opposition to try to oust the government there. And so they're very familiar with this here. But like I said, also in other parts of the world, United States is a very uncomfortable neighbor for us. And we've gone through various political cycles where peoples have realized the implications of a close alliance with the United States, and we're just not in favor of it anymore. You know, in the case of Mexico here, we are the #1 trading partner, but obviously Mexico's also looked towards developing its South-South relationships with other countries here in the region and beyond, and there's a very different world. You know, this isn't, you know, the early 2000s where the United States could try to push its weight around. There is a very highly developed consciousness amongst the populations here. So fortunately, we have seen the response. But I do think that we can't stop. We have to be relentless about our organizing around this. You know, they've seen some domestic criticism, you know, a handful of U.S. politicians kind of drawing attention to the fact that the U.S. is basically engaged in another war without having gone to Congress. And that pushback is important, but we have to keep pressing, particularly inside the belly of the beast, because right now, stopping this has to happen in conjunction with actions inside of the United States to make it clear that even Trump supporters don't want another war. He sold himself to the population as the peace president, as someone who was going to avoid getting into another armed conflict. Well, right now, because he's listening to Marco Rubio, who's listening to the Venezuelan opposition, who's feeding them all of these lies about what's happening in Venezuela, letting him think that this is actually going to be a successful strategy, well, they're about to start another war that not only will make a heightened conflict in South America, but it'll change the mood in the entire region against the United States, even more so than it already is today.
Well, we will definitely be keeping an eye on this story. We don't really have much of a choice because they just keep sending American military equipment to the Caribbean as they allow children in America to go hungry because of priorities. Jose, I want to thank you so much for joining us, Mexican journalist with Venezuela Analysis. We really appreciate you, and we will definitely be discussing this with you again soon, unfortunately, but also fortunate to have you.
Absolutely. Anytime. Happy to join you.
And I want to use this as an opportunity to remind people that I interviewed Zoe yesterday for dispatches to have a very long discussion about the growing escalation on Venezuela. I guess it's kind of redundant, but the escalation on Venezuela and sort of the history behind that. And we get into the nitty gritty and also kind of get into our own personal experience.
I was going to say,
on the ground in
Rania,
Venezuela. Yeah. Go ahead.
Our own
go ahead,
personal
Zoe.
experience of the coup.
Yeah,
which was real.
Literally last year. Yeah, last year you and I were in Venezuela. And we saw a fascist coup attempt that CNN was convinced was actually democracy.
Just
amazing.
Democracy in our eyes. But really, I mean, if you don't believe Venezuelans, at least believe your trusted hosts.
Yeah.
It was a fascist coup attempt.
Unbelievable. Speaking of trusted hosts, Zoe, you were fantastic to host with today.
Well, it was a great
this.
honor. It was a great honor.
I saw somebody in the comments congratulate Eugene on a fantastic makeover.
I mean, I'm wearing a kind of Eugene adjacent shirt to not stray too far.
Right.
To just kind of stay on theme.
We don't want to overwhelm or confuse the audience too much.
Too much.
Too much. We can change gender, we can change the race, but we got to keep the clothes somewhat on point. Wow, this is getting weird. One thing I did love, though, that we did a fantastic job of repeatedly doing is me interrupting you during the last question of almost every single segment we did. Maybe that can be like our shtick.
It's our shtick.
Like, I'm like, is it your turn or is it my turn? I don't know.
We're too polite. We're too polite. But I think... No, I was just going to say that whole show left me with the question, which we should answer together, which is Trump a president of peace?
Oh my God, he certainly ran as one.
He certainly ran as one.
Yeah, and he keeps going around saying that he like ended like 7 wars. But I just keep looking around and I'm like, which one?
There's more wars.
Like starting, yeah. Right?
But I guess the real question is, will he win the Nobel Peace Prize?
I mean, I feel like given the history of Nobel Peace Prize winners like Henry Kissinger, Maria
Corina Machado,
Barack Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize. It was kind of funny. They were like hoping if they gave it to him, it would be like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And instead he just like did a lot of drone strikes and laughed about it. Started some new wars himself. So I feel like I guess Trump, it would make sense. It would be very on brand. I'll put it that way. If Donald Trump won the Nobel Peace Prize. All that said, I want to thank everybody who tuned in today. Despite the fact that I want to like pull my hair out because YouTube just like hates. It's really frustrating, Zoe, because like, you know, we built up a big audience here at Breakthrough News with a lot of hard work and dedication. And then it's amazing these social media companies can just come in and like slash that. Like, slash that completely. I was looking at the comments. I was a little, I'll cop to it. I read the comments. Everybody who watches this show regularly knows I do. And one person made a really good point. They were like, you have over 1 million subscribers and you have like 100 viewers. Like that is actually a crime. Which I agree, that is like almost war crime territory, and you should sue YouTube. But like, that's the situation we're in with these social media companies. It's like if someone who is in a high position there just decides they don't like you because they don't like your opinion, they can just like press a button, and suddenly everything you've built, it's like you might as well just have 5,000 followers because no one who follows you can see your content.
Yeah, I mean, we really are. When people talk about the battle of ideas, we have to remember that it is a battle. And the best way for our content to get out to people is from, you know, our viewers, our audience, people who have been following our projects for years, to be kind of spokespersons of the projects, because we will never have the money and the connections that these mainstream bourgeois outlets have, but we do have what they don't have, which is dedicated viewers and followers and people who really believe in what we're saying and the stories that we're telling. These bourgeois outlets will never be able to give you the perspective that we will. They'll never tell you the stories that we're telling you. You'll never walk away from watching a bourgeois show and say, wow, I feel inspired. And I know that despite all of the suffering that's happening, there's a better future. So all that to say, hopefully that was an inspirational pitch for people to support our projects, share, and make sure that the algorithm doesn't crush us.
Yeah. And one person in the comments during the live stream said, when I began watching the show 2 years ago, there were 1,000 plus watching. Now it's only 100 plus. YouTube are effing with you for not being neoliberal enough, Rania. And to that I say, I'm just going to become a neoliberal. Like,
I won't
if
let
that makes
you.
YouTube happy. No, like if we have to be like compliant on neoliberalism, I'll do it like this. I'll be like, look, privatizing Social Security is a great idea, even if it leads to people dying.
That might work. We're gonna have to we're gonna have to do some focus groups on that one.
Yeah. I mean, look, it depends. The people won't like it, but will YouTube. I see the followers growing. We're back at 1,000 now. They're like, that's how it works. They're like, good job. That's
free market, baby.
Yeah, we're all about the free market here at Breakthrough News. But in all seriousness, thank you everybody who tuned in. I want to remind you that to support our show here, our programs here, all of our journalism, our written content as well. We're also on all social media outlets where we're not as suppressed. Go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. It helps us keep going and growing against the algorithm that hates us. And Zoe, I want to thank you for co-hosting. This was really, really fun. And the people will tell us what they want. Was she fantastic, you guys, or what? I don't have a place for you to answer that, but there you go. The people have spoken. But to all our listeners, to all our viewers, especially, by the way, I forgot to shout out Free Speech TV to everybody who's watching there. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Freedom Side Live, and we will see you next time.